The embers, they're almost gone. I made a mistake. I went past the tree line after midnight because the cold was freezing my joints. I gathered the fallen oak, but every time I drop a branch into the pit, a matching snap comes from the laurels. It's not an echo. It's matching the weight. It's waiting for me to run out of wood. Let me take you back to how it started. Let me take you back slow, so you understand what I didn't at the time. The ridge didn't have a name on any map I'd carried. Not on the paper one I'd folded down to a soft, dog-eared square after 3 weeks on the trail. And not on the phone I'd stopped trusting somewhere past the Virginia border when the signal had dissolved into nothing more reliable than a compass needle's quiet suggestion. The trailhead, registered 2 days south, had called this stretch of the Appalachian unmaintained past the seasonal closure, and whoever had penned that entry had done so in a handwriting that pressed hard into the page, like they wanted the indentation to survive after the ink faded. I hadn't taken that seriously enough. The cold had come in the way bad things often do on those mountains. Not with any ceremony, not with the dramatic dropping of a barometer, but quietly, gradually, the way a room goes dark when the sun moves rather than when someone flips a switch. By the time I registered the true severity of it, the temperature had already fallen past the point where my body was making reasonable decisions. My fingers had gone from aching to numb, and numb had started breeding into a kind of dull, foggy acceptance that should have frightened me more than it did. The lean-to shelter was nothing impressive. 3 walls of weathered hemlock planking, gray as old bone, with a corrugated metal roof that had been patched in 2 places with what looked like flattened soup cans, the rust bleeding down in long brown streaks like old tears. The 4th side faced down the ridge, open to the mountain, and on any temperate evening that open face would have felt inviting, a place to sit and watch the last of the daylight retreat behind the tree line. That evening, it felt like a wound that couldn't be closed. There was a fire pit at the shelter's mouth, a ring of round stones pulled from what I imagined had been a nearby creek, though the creek itself, if it existed, was buried somewhere beneath a foot of crusted old snow. The stones were black with the soot of 100 previous fires. Someone had been kind enough at some point in the warm season to stack a modest pile of split wood against the shelter's inner wall, sheltered from rain, the pieces cut clean and pale at their ends. Red oak mostly, and a little ash, dry as chalk. I didn't think twice about those pieces. I was grateful for them in the way you are grateful for small mercies when your body is approaching its edge. I built the fire with the last of my fat fighters, those paraffin-soaked cotton squares I'd been rationing since Georgia, and I fed that fire carefully, nursing it the way you nurse something fragile, And for a while, for perhaps an hour, things were fine. Things were quiet. The fog had come up from the valley below the shelter's open face, rising slowly, and had moved through the trees the way cold smoke moves, never quite settling, never quite dispersing, pooling in the low places and threading itself through the laurel thickets that crowded the slope on the shelter's left and right flanks. The mountain laurel out here grew the way it always does in the deep hollows, dense and low and tangled, the old trunks twisting around each other in configurations that looked almost deliberate, like something that had been braided rather than grown. In the dark, the laurels were a wall, a curtain. The firelight touched the outermost branches and stopped there, as if the darkness beyond had mass. The woodpile ran down faster than I'd expected. I want you to understand how cold it was. I want you to feel it, if you can, lying wherever you are right now, in your warmth. The kind of cold that settles into the joints first, the knees and knuckles. The cold that makes your hip flexors feel like they're wrapped in wet cement. The cold where every breath you take comes back to you tasting of iron and frost. And the simple act of existing begins to feel like labor. That is where I was. The stack of wood against the shelter's wall had diminished to a scattered few pieces, and the night was nowhere near finished, and the fog was thickening, and the cold was pressing inward from that open fourth wall with a slow, implacable patience. I knew the rule. Every hiker who'd spent any real time in Appalachia, who'd sat long enough with someone who'd been raised in those mountains, had heard some version of it. Don't gather wood after dark. Don't cross the shelter's perimeter past midnight. The old-timers phrased it different ways. Some spoke it as practical wisdom about deadfall and unstable ground in the black of night, about twisting an ankle out beyond earshot, about predators that moved in the small hours. But there was always something else underneath those practical reasons, something that the teller never quite named. A hesitation before the explanation, a looking away. I had heard it. I had filed it the way you file things that seem rooted in superstition when your rational mind is warm and fed and sitting safe inside a well-lit room. My rational mind was not warm. My rational mind was barely functional. My body was making the choices now. I pulled on my headlamp and my shell jacket, and I stepped past the ring of stones and out past the edge of the firelight, and then past the corner of the lean-to's side wall, and I moved into the dark at the tree line, with my eyes sweeping the headlamp's thin white beam across the ground, searching for deadfall. There was plenty. A windstorm had come through here sometime in the autumn, it looked like, and the oaks at the edge of the tree line had shed liberally. Long branches, thick at the base, some of them still dense with dried leaves that rustled as I dragged them. I made 3 trips. I worked quickly, the way you work when the cold is biting at the back of your neck and the dark beyond your headlamp feels close. I didn't look into the laurels. I gathered what I could, and I went back inside the circle of firelight, and I fed the fire until it was speaking again in that low, settling voice that fires have. The relief I felt was physical, a slackening. I crouched close to the fire and let the heat move back into my hands, and I listened to the wood catching, the small ticks and pops of moisture releasing, the low breath of the flame. And then I dropped a thick branch into the pit. The sound it made was the hollow, resonant knock of dense oak striking the stone ring's edge before it settled into the bed of coals. A particular sound, weight and density together, a sound with a specific grammar. I was still crouched when it came back. From the laurels, not 12 feet off the shelter's left flank, the same sound, not similar, not approximately the same sound, produced in the same moment of silence that followed my fire feeding, in the same tonal register, carrying the same sense of mass and impact as the branch I had just dropped. I told myself it was an echo. I straightened slowly and tilted my head, and told myself that the ridge behind the shelter was catching the sound and returning it with some compression, some fold in the geography that made echoes behave strangely up here. I'd heard of that before. I'd read about acoustic phenomena in mountainous terrain. I was a rational person. I waited a long while. The fire steadied. I reached for a small piece, a thin, dry stick, barely worth the name of tinder, the kind of piece that snaps in your hand when you bend it. I held it over the fire and let it fall, a tiny, brittle snap from the laurels. Immediate, proportional. I set my hands on my knees and I looked at the woodpile and I thought about what I was doing. I thought about it carefully. I thought about the distance from the laurels to the shelter. I thought about what the space inside those tangled trunks looked like in daylight. Low and lightless, the branches interwoven, the dead leaves matted on the ground in deep, damp layers. I thought about what would have to be inside that space to produce sounds like that. I thought about its hands, if it had hands, pressed flat into the cold ground, adjusting its weight in response to each piece I fed to the fire. My next breath came out unsteady. I picked up a piece I had been saving, a heavy, round section of branch as thick as my forearm, dense as a hammerhead, the kind of peace that falls from a tree with a sound that carries half a mile. I held it in both hands above the pit for a long moment. I was testing something. I was conducting an experiment I did not want to conduct. I let it drop. The thud from the laurels came one breath after, deeper than anything that should have been made by a branch, a sound that seemed to come up from the ground itself, as if something of considerable mass had shifted its weight forward. And it was closer, not by much, but closer. That is when I understood that it was counting, not just mimicking, counting, keeping a running inventory of what I had left, measuring the distance between this moment and the moment the fire died. It knew what I had brought back from the tree line because it had been there, in the dark while I gathered it. It had watched me work. It knew the exact dimensions of my woodpile the way a patient thing knows the capacity of what it is waiting on. I sat very still. I did not move for a long time. The fire did not wait for me. Fires never do. Piece by piece, with the deliberateness of someone disarming something, I fed the pit. Each piece brought a response from the laurels. Each response was a fraction closer than the last. Not rushing, never rushing, just tightening the perimeter with a slow geometry that was almost mathematical in its patience. The fog had moved up fully onto the ridge now, thick and white in the firelight, and beyond the circle of orange warmth, the world had become a formless gray-white nothing. And somewhere inside that nothing, the laurels stood. And inside the laurels, something crouched and counted and waited. I could smell it, I think. Or perhaps I was only imagining that I could. The air coming off the left flank of the shelter had taken on a quality, deep and wet and rooted, like the underside of old bark, like the smell of a place where standing water had rotted something large down to its bones, and then the cold had preserved what was left. There are smells that the human body responds to before the mind catches up. My body had already responded. My hands were not shaking from the cold anymore. The woodpile was 5 pieces, then 4, 3. With 2 pieces left, I stopped feeding the fire and simply sat with my arms wrapped around my knees and watched the coals. They were still bright, orange fading at the edges to red, and the flames were low but present, casting just enough light to make the open 4th wall of the shelter into a bright rectangle, and the world beyond it into a flat black painting. There was no sound from the laurels now, no sound at all. Not the settling of branches, not the movement of small animals, not even wind, though I could feel a cold breath moving through the shelter from somewhere. The silence had a quality to it, a fullness, the way a room sounds full even before you turn the lights on and see someone standing in the corner. 2 pieces, then 1. This is where I am now as I speak these words into this recorder for whoever finds it, for whatever that is worth. 1 piece of wood left, held across my knees, and the coals dying down from orange to something darker, something that gives off heat without light, and the cold already reclaiming the edges of the shelter, working in from the corners. I have been sitting here a long time, trying to think clearly. If I put this last piece in, the fire will have another 20 minutes perhaps less. And the sound that comes back from the laurels will come from just outside the firelight's edge, just outside, where the orange stops and the dark begins. If I don't put it in, the fire dies sooner, and the dark is the same dark either way. The coals are dim now, that deep pulsing red of something spent, something that has given all it has to give. I can feel the cold on my face. I can feel it on the backs of my hands. The fog is thickened so completely that I can no longer see the tree line. Even the shapes of the nearest laurels have been swallowed. And there is only this, the small, warm circle around me, which is growing smaller, and the dark, which is not. There is no sound from the thickets. That is almost worse than the sound was. I am holding the last piece of wood in both hands. It is rough-barked and cold now, heavier than it felt when I carried it out of the dark. The fire is asking for it. I can feel the heat pulling at it from below, the way a flame reaches. I think I understand now what the old rule was protecting. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about deadfall or broken ankles or predators that move at night. The rule was a negotiation, a boundary, a line drawn not in the dirt, but in time. Midnight, as a threshold, as a door that once stepped through cannot be unstepped through. I stepped through it. The coals are the color of dying rust now, barely glowing. The cold has reached my shoulders. I am looking at the last piece of wood. I am looking at the dark beyond the shelter's open face. And in the silence I can hear, or perhaps only feel, something adjusting its weight, settling, waiting. Sleep well now. The fire is still burning. You are warm. You are inside. Whatever moves in the laurels tonight, it is not counting your wood. If the mountains call to you tonight, subscribe. There are darker hollows yet to wander, and I'll be here, waiting at the next shelter down the trail. And if you heard something in the dark while you listened, leave it in the comments. You wouldn't be the first. The horizon line shifted. That's what I need you to understand before anything else. The horizon line shifted, and the mountains were in the wrong place. I could see them through the glass, clear as a church bell on a cold morning. But they were wrong. The peaks were wrong. The valleys folded in on themselves like something had reached down and pressed the whole landscape into a shape it was never meant to hold. And at the bottom of the stone steps, you understand what I mean when I say the stone steps, the ones that don't appear on any map I've ever seen. Something was standing there, tall, taller than anything that has a right to stand on two legs. Thin, the way a shadow is thin when the sun is low and mean and the light has no warmth left in it. Just standing, looking up at me through whatever passes for eyes on a thing like that. And it had already started walking. Now, let me take you back to the beginning, because the beginning matters when you're trying to make sense of a thing that doesn't want to be made sense of. This was late October, a Saturday, though the day of the week stopped meaning anything after the second night on the ridge. I had been hiking a stretch of the Appalachian Trail through the high country of western North Carolina, up where the elevation sits above 4,000 feet, and the air is thin enough that you feel it in your chest like a quiet warning. the kind of country where the trees are old. Not old the way a man is old, but old the way stone is old. Old in a way that needs no acknowledgement from anyone. A 3-day solo trip. Just me, a pack weighing close to 40 pounds, and the trail. The first day was fine. Clear skies, the leaves already gone to rust and copper the way they do at elevation before they do down in the valleys. I made good time. I felt the way you're supposed to feel out there. Small, but purposefully small. Like you've put yourself in proper proportion to the world. The second day, the fog came in. It didn't roll in the way fog does in the movies. It arrived the way bad news arrives from someone who's been keeping it from you too long. Gradually, quietly. You look up and the ridge has gone soft at the edges. And then you look again and it's simply gone, absorbed into the white. Everything beyond a certain distance became suggestion. The idea of a tree. The idea of a world continuing past the limit of your sight. By early afternoon, the white blazes on the trees would disappear for long stretches. You'd walk, and then there'd be one, sudden and white against dark bark, and you'd feel a loosening in your chest, proof of how tight you'd been holding yourself. The old-timers in these mountains have things to say about the high trails in fog season. Families that came up from the hollows and never came back down. I had heard some of their lore before the trip, from a man behind the counter of a small hardware store who spoke slowly while he handed me my water purification tablets. He told me not to leave the marked trail, not for any reason. No shortcuts, no game paths, no cutting down into the unmapped hollows. I remember nodding, the way you nod when someone older tells you something cautious, and you're still young enough or foolish enough to hear it as anything other than lived experience. He told me one other thing, almost as an afterthought, but I noticed he stopped what he was doing with his hands when he said it. He looked at me directly. He said, "The overlooks are not for nighttime. The stone platforms with the binoculars on them. Whatever you do, don't put money in those viewers after dark." I asked him why. He held my eyes for a moment. Then he went back to counting out my change and said simply that some things are built to show you what's there, and some things are built to show you what isn't. And in the dark, on a high ridge, you don't always have the luxury of knowing which is which before it's too late. I thanked him. I drove to the trailhead. I told myself it was local color. Mountains are full of old stories because old people live in them, and old people have long winters in which to sharpen those memories into shapes that keep the grandchildren close to the fire. I told myself all of that right up until the moment I was standing on that concrete platform in the dark, fishing a quarter out of my jacket pocket with fingers I could barely feel. The second night was when things began to go wrong. I had been counting on reaching a 3-sided lean-to shelter before full dark. In bad weather at high elevation, the difference between a structure and no structure is the difference between cold and dangerous cold. The fog had cost me 2 hours backtracking from what I was certain was the path, only to find it ended in old deadfall and laurel thickets so thick you couldn't push through without losing equipment or skin. By the time the light was fully gone, the temperature had dropped in a way that felt personal. The kind of cold that gets into your ears and stays there. Reminds you what you are, which is soft, which is warm-blooded, which is not built for this. Your mind begins to offer you deals when you're genuinely lost. It says, if you walk in this direction, that will probably be right. It says, you recognize that tree, don't you? It says, the shelter is just a little further. It has to be, because the alternative is spending the night sitting with your back against a tree in 30-degree fog, which is survivable, but the kind of survivable that leaves marks. I had been walking for what felt like an hour past when I should have reached the shelter when the ground changed under my feet. The trail was dirt packed hard by decades of boots, but what I stepped onto was different. Flat, stone, man-laid. I swept the headlamp low. Concrete, gray and cracked in long, slow fissures. It widened. It ended in a low railing of iron pipe, gone deep brown with rust, and beyond the railing was nothing but fog. A concrete observation platform jutting out from the edge of the ridge into open air, into the blinding white void. I didn't know where I was. I only knew I had found something solid, something human hands had placed here, and in the dark and the fog that felt like an anchor. I swept the light across the platform. In the center, bolted to a low concrete pillar, was the viewfinder. Cast iron, heavy, painted dark green at some point in the distant past, though the paint had long since gone to flake and rust. The eyepiece angled downward, a coin slot at the back, and to either side the handles, thick bars of iron worn smooth from decades of hands. The metal was black with cold. Sitting out in this fog, absorbing the mountain's particular kind of cold, the kind that comes from elevation and moisture and wind moving across exposed rock with nothing to slow it down. I put my hand on the near side handle. The cold came through my glove immediately, through the fleece and into my palm and up my wrist like a current. Out in the fog below the ridge there was nothing. No valley lights, no road shimmer, no sound of any living thing. Just the white, just the smothering white. I needed a bearing, a reference point, something to tell me which direction the trail ran. I fished the quarter from my jacket pocket and found the slot by feel. I want to pause here. This is where everything turns on its axis. I thought about what the man in the hardware store had said. I thought about it clearly, and then I let it go. The way you let go of things when the practical need is immediate, and the warning came from someone you don't know well enough to fully trust. The shutter opened. The fog was gone. I need to say that clearly, because clarity is what that first moment was. Not the white blankness I had been standing inside for hours. Clear, crystal clear, in a way that high mountain air is almost never clear. No haze, no softening of edges. Like looking through glass so perfect you forget the glass is there. The landscape was lit by a source I couldn't identify. Not moonlight, not starlight. Something else. Cold and even and without warmth. The way light from a very old source looks when it has traveled long enough to lose whatever made it warm. I knew this mountain. 2 days on it. But what I was looking at was not that. The ridgeline held the same rough shape, the bones of the elevation. But everything else was wrong in a way I couldn't categorize. Trees in wrong places. Not like they'd been moved, but like they belonged to some other time, when the mountain had been shaped by something other than weather. The valley floor too flat, the sky above it too dark, and the stone steps. There were no stone steps on this overlook. Concrete platform, iron railing, nothing else. But through the viewfinder, below the platform, wide stone steps descended into that wrongly lit valley. Old steps, cut into the rock face itself. And at the bottom of those steps, at the far edge of where the light met the unmapped dark, there was a shape. I pulled back from the eyepiece. White. Blinding, total, formless white fog. The real world. The cold. The sound of the wind. I looked back through the glass. The shape had moved up 3 steps. It was tall. The way something is tall when its proportions are simply different from anything you know. The legs too long, the torso too long, the angle of the shoulders wrong in a way that made something animal in my chest go very still. It had no face I could see from that distance, or rather, It had the suggestion of one, the implication, the way a shadow on a wall implies the thing that cast it, without being the thing itself. It moved with purpose, not fast, not rushing. The unhurried certainty of something that has always known where it's going, and never had reason to hurry because the destination has never gone anywhere. I pulled back again. White fog, wind, the ticking of the mechanism audible through the metal casing now, slow and deep and patient. I looked back through, halfway up the steps. My hands were on the iron handles, and I understood something then. Not in the thinking part of me, not in the part that reasons and constructs explanations. The deeper part, the part that has lived in the body longer than reasoning has. The act of looking was a participation. The coin in the slot was a kind of consent, and the ticking was not the winding down of a neutral timer. It was a countdown. When the shutter closed, the thing would not be at the bottom of the stone steps anymore. The ticking was slower now, and slower ticking should have felt like more time, but it felt like the opposite, like the weight of each remaining second was growing. I looked through the glass. The shape was on the top step, standing at the edge of the platform, looking up. The place where its face should have been was turned toward the eyepiece, toward me. What served it for eyes was not dark as I had expected. It was bright. Two faint points of brightness, the color of the light that had no warmth, set in a face of all wrong geometry and all wrong proportion. It was still not rushing. It didn't need to rush. I let go of the handles. I stepped back from the pillar. My boots found the cracked concrete, and I moved backward toward the iron railing, and I stood there in the white fog with my headlamp throwing its small yellow light across the empty platform and the rusted viewfinder. The ticking stopped. I don't know how I got off that mountain. I know I moved. I followed instinct and luck and the occasional white blaze until the ground changed and I found the lean-to shelter, cold enough that my hands shook for an hour after I climbed into my sleeping bag. I lay there listening to the fog move through the trees, and I thought about the man in the hardware store and what he had said about things built to show you what's there versus things built to show you what isn't. I have a different understanding of that now. Not a complete one, just a shaped absence, the way something gone leaves a mark in the space it occupied. What I know is this: the overlooks are old, older than the Park Service plaques suggest. The iron and concrete are mid-century, maybe, but the placement, the specific positions on the ridge, those are older. They mark something, not a view, or not only a view. Every time I looked through that viewfinder, the shape moved closer. It needed the looking the way something crossing rough water needs a bridge. The viewfinder was not a window. It was a passage. And the coin in the slot was not a payment for a service. It was an invitation. The mountains are quiet tonight. Up on the high balls where the wind goes long and low and the fog moves through the laurel like something with its own slow intentions. Up where the stone overlooks stand in the dark with their rusted iron viewers, coin slots empty, shutters closed. Waiting. Not impatiently. Patience isn't the right word, because patience implies the awareness of time, and I don't believe what waits in those lenses has much relationship with time. It simply exists. In whatever unmapped hollow the viewfinder looks down into, it simply exists, the way stone exists. The way the dark between the stars exists, without needing anything from us, except when we offer it something, except when we put a coin in the slot. Close your eyes now. The rain is coming down on the high country, on the old-growth timber, on the granite and the shale and the packed trail dirt, on the three-sided shelters where tonight's hikers are settling into their bags, listening to the rain on the roof, the cold kept at one remove by good insulation and earned exhaustion. Let that sound carry you. The sound of mountain rain in the last hours before morning, when the dark is as deep as it will go before it starts the long, slow turn toward gray, toward dawn, toward another day of ordinary light on ordinary stone. Let it carry you down into the valley, into the quiet, into the place where the fog doesn't reach and the viewfinders are far above you, up on the ridge in the dark, and whatever they hold is far away and getting farther. You are here. You are warm. You are a long way from the stone overlooks and the turning of the shutter and the slow, certain footfall on the steps. Sleep now. The rain is just rain tonight. bark is touching my collarbone now. I did not move toward it. It moved toward me. Or the trail did. Or whatever this place has become did. And somewhere behind me, close enough that I could reach back and touch it if I dared, I can hear the wet, patient sound of a brush dragging slow lines onto the back of a trunk, painting, sealing the door I came through. It is not in a hurry. It has never once been in a hurry. And that, my friend, that unhurried patience is the worst sound these old ears have ever carried. But you do not know this yet. You are not here yet. So let me take your hand gently, the way I always do, and let me walk you back before the fog had a name, back before the paint was wet, back to the beginning of the night, when the mountains still belonged to you, and you to it, and the only sound on that ridge was the sound of your own boots and your own breath, slow and even, the way breath should be before everything changes. Settle in now. There is a long road ahead of us, and we are going to walk it together, slowly, the way the old trails were meant to be walked. It begins, as these things so often do, with weight, the honest animal weight of a pack settling into the small of your back as you rise from a boulder where you had stopped to rest. 40 pounds, maybe a little more. The straps worn soft from 300 miles of Appalachian dirt. The hip belt cinched tight enough to remind you with every step that you are carrying your whole small world on your shoulders. Water, a thin sleeping bag rated for temperatures that autumn in the high country does not always respect. A headlamp with batteries you have been rationing since Damascus. A map, folded so many times the creases have gone soft as cloth. A map you have stopped consulting because you know this section, or believe you do, the way a man believes he knows the back of his own hand, until the lights go out. It was October, late October, the kind of October that comes to the high balls of southern Appalachia like a held breath. The leaves had already turned and begun to fall, and the forest floor was a quilt of rust and gold going soft and dark with the first wet of the season. By day, the ridges had been beautiful in that aching, indifferent way mountains are beautiful. Long views falling away into blue. But the sun sets early up there, and it sets hard, dropping behind the western wall of peaks like a door closing. And you had misjudged, just slightly, just enough, how many miles remained between you and the shelter you had marked for the night. That is how it always starts, isn't it? Not with one grand mistake, but with a dozen small, honest ones, stacked quietly, one on top of the other, until they make a shape you did not intend. The fog came up out of the hollows the way it does on those ridges in autumn, rising rather than falling, climbing the mountainside from the valleys below like something that had waited all day for the temperature to drop enough to let it move. You noticed it first as a softening at the edges of your headlamp beam, a kind of halo, and you told yourself, the way hikers do, that it was nothing, that it would burn off. But it did not burn off. It thickened, mile by mile, until the beam of your headlamp simply stopped a few feet in front of your boots and gave up, swallowed whole. And the world you were walking through narrowed down to a small cone of gray light and the dark, wet, breathing shapes of trees just beyond it. You know that fog. Everyone who has walked at night in those mountains knows that fog. It does not feel like weather. It feels like a presence that has agreed for now to let you pass through it. You were on a switchback by then, one of those long, patient, doubling back climbs the trail builders cut into the steepest parts of the ridge so that the grade would be kind to the knees, even if it is cruel to the spirit. Because a switchback at midnight in fog asks you to trust a system you cannot see. You trust the blazes, that is the whole of it. Two white rectangles painted vertically on the trunks of trees, one above the other, a few feet apart. That is the language of the Appalachian Trail, the only language it speaks. And every hiker learns it in the marrow before they learn almost anything else. One blaze means continue. Two blazes, stacked, mean turn, and turn sharply. Because the trail is about to do something the body would not expect on its own. You had been counting on that language all night. Single blaze, single blaze, single blaze. The rhythm of it almost like breathing, almost like a lullaby you did not know you were singing to yourself in the dark. And then, on a switchback so tight the trail seemed to fold back on its own shadow, your headlamp caught white on bark and you stopped, the way you were trained to stop. Because a double blaze means slow down, means the mountain is about to ask something of you. But it was not two. It was three. Three white rectangles, vertical, stacked one above the other, freshly painted, so fresh that in the wet, cold air you could still smell the faint chemical sweetness of latex paint cutting through the smell of damp hemlock and rotting leaf litter, a smell that should not have been there, a smell that meant a hand, a human hand, had been at that tree recently enough that the paint had not yet cured in the cold. You stood there longer than you should have, swaying slightly under the weight of the pack, turning the fact over in your fogged and tired mind. 3 blazes. You searched your memory, the way a man searches a drawer for something he is almost certain is there. Some trail clubs marked emergency reroutes with a 3rd blaze, a detour around a washed-out section, a temporary path to a backcountry shelter when the main trail was unsafe. It was not unreasonable. It was, in fact, almost comforting, the idea that someone, some trail angel with a paint can and a headlamp of their own, had come through ahead of you and left a kindness in the fog, a way to a lean-to, a roof of sorts, maybe a fire and other hikers, and the particular relief of human voices after hours of nothing but your own breath and the drip of fog off the rhododendron leaves. So you left the white places you knew, the two-stroke language you had trusted for 300 miles, and you stepped instead onto a thinner track that curved away from the switchback and went, almost immediately, straight down into a wall of laurel. That is the mistake. I want you to feel its shape, even now, even knowing what you know. It was not a foolish mistake. It was a reasonable one, made by a reasonable, exhausted person at midnight in fog thick enough to drink, following a language that had never once lied to them before. That is what makes it the kind of mistake the mountain loves best. The laurel thicket swallowed the fog and the headlamp light together, and for the first 100 yards or so the new trail felt almost generous. It was narrower than the main trail, certainly, brushy at the edges, the kind of path that suggested infrequent use rather than disuse. Exactly, you told yourself, what a little-known emergency reroute should feel like. The footing was soft with old leaf mold. The grade was gentle, descending slightly, which felt right, felt like a path designed for tired feet at the end of a long day. And every 50 yards or so, right when the dark pressed in close enough to make your chest tighten, your light would catch it again. 3 white blazes, freshly painted, patient, reassuring you that you had not lost the thread. You did not notice, not yet, that you never once saw the trail crew that should have left boot prints in that soft mud. You did not notice that no other hiker's track, no other sign of human passage beyond the paint itself, marked that corridor through the laurel. The mind, at midnight, in fog, carrying 40 pounds, is a generous editor. It cuts the footage that does not fit the story it has already decided to believe. A mile passed, maybe more. Distance becomes a strange, elastic thing in fog at night. There is no horizon to measure it against, only the rhythm of your own boots and the white rectangles appearing one set after another, just at the edge of where your light gave out. The trail had narrowed, not dramatically, not in any way you could have pointed to and said, "Here, this is where it changed." But the laurel that had brushed your shoulders now brushed both shoulders at once, the branches closing overhead in a low tunnel that forced you to duck. And the path itself, which had been boot width with room to spare, had become precisely boot width, no more. Your boots finding the only clear ground available rather than choosing it. The forest, you told yourself, is simply old here. Old laurel grows thick. Old laurel does this. You have walked through worse tunnels of rhododendron on sunnier days and thought nothing of it. This is only worse because it is dark and you are tired, and the fog plays tricks with distance and depth that your eyes were never built to solve. You did not let yourself think the other thought, the mathematical one, the one that would have told you a trail does not narrow at a constant, deliberate rate over the course of a mile, unless something or someone intends it to, somewhere in the second mile. And I want you to feel the slowness of this, the patience of it, because that patience is the entire point. You became aware, in the dim animal part of the brain that never quite sleeps, that the fog behind you had a different quality than the fog ahead. Ahead it was simply fog, gray, drifting, indifferent. Behind, it seemed to hold its shape a moment longer before dispersing, as though something had recently passed through it and left an eddy in its wake. You turned your head once, your light sweeping back along the tunnel of laurel you had just walked, and you saw nothing. Of course you saw nothing. You were meant to see nothing. That is the particular cruelty of a thing that has learned, perhaps over a very long time, exactly how far behind a frightened person it needs to stay. You walked faster after that, though you told yourself it was only the cold driving your pace, only the late hour, only the simple animal wish to reach a shelter and lie down. The trail did not argue with your hurry. It simply continued to narrow, and the laurel gave way, gradually, to denser stands of young hemlock, the trunks closer together than hemlock usually grows, packed in tight as fingers laced together, and the smell of them, that bitter green-black smell of hemlock needles crushed underfoot, the smell of cold sap and wet bark, thickened around you until it felt less like a scent and more like a kind of pressure against the inside of your skull. It was somewhere past the second mile, perhaps closer to the third, that you first had to turn your shoulders sideways to pass between two trunks that, only 100 yards back, had allowed you to walk through facing forward without a thought. You laughed, a short, breathless sound that did not sound like your own laugh, and you told yourself this was simply how second-growth forest crowded in on old trail corridors. Natural, ordinary, explainable. And ahead of you, just at the edge of the light, 3 white blazes, freshly painted, glistening faintly with a wetness that the cold air should have long since dried. You did not stop to ask yourself how paint applied at midnight in near-freezing fog could still be wet a mile, 2 miles, 3 miles into your walk. The mind, when it is being led somewhere it should not go, is very good at not asking the one question that would end the journey. The pinch points came more often after that, every quarter mile, then every 100 yards, the trunks pressing in close enough that you had to exhale fully to slide your shoulders and your pack through the gap, the bark dragging cold and rough against the fabric of your jacket, against, eventually, the bare skin of your hands when you reached out to brace yourself. Your breath had changed by then, too. You would have noticed it if you had still been the kind of traveler who noticed things calmly. Gone shallow and quick, the rhythm of a body beginning, in some wordless animal register, to understand a truth the mind was still refusing to say out loud. And somewhere in that stretch, in a gap between two hemlocks so narrow you had to turn your pack sideways and push it through ahead of you, you heard for the first time the sound behind you. Not footsteps, nothing so simple, so human as footsteps. A soft, wet, dragging sound, rhythmic, deliberate, the unmistakable sound of a brush being drawn across bark, slow and even, the sound of something taking its time to paint a fresh triple blaze on the reverse side of a tree you had only just passed, sealing with patient and unhurried care the same gap you had only just forced your body through. You understood then, didn't you? Though you did not yet have the words for it. The trail was not narrowing because the forest was old. The trail was narrowing because something was closing it as you went, compressing the only space available to you, herding you forward the only direction left to go, while marking just as carefully that there was no longer a way back. By the time the trunks first touched your chest, both shoulders pinned at once, the cold, rough bark pressing your ribs the way a door frame presses a man too large to pass through it, you had stopped pretending to yourself that any of this made sense. The hemlocks here grew close as prison bars, packed so tight that no natural forest, however old, however undisturbed, should ever have grown this way. Geometry bending past what root and soil and sunlight could explain. And ahead of you, always just at the failing edge of your light, 3 white blazes, fresh, glistening, patient, leading you on into a vice that had, somewhere behind you in the dark and the fog, already finished sealing itself shut. The bark is touching my collarbone now. I did not move toward it. And so we are back where we began, my friend, you and I, here at the narrowest part of the dark, with the wet sound of a brush still moving somewhere behind us, slow, unhurried, patient as the mountain itself. There is nowhere to go now but forward, into whatever space the trees still allow, however small that space has become. But you are tired. You have walked a very long way tonight, farther than these old legs of mine have walked in years, and the body, even at the edge of a vice, even at the edge of the dark, knows how to let go when it has carried enough. So let your shoulders soften now, here in the telling of it, safe in your own bed, far from any ridge, any fog, any wet paint drying on the backs of trees. Let your breath slow to match mine. There is no trail beneath you tonight. There is no third blaze waiting at the edge of your light. There is only the sound of my voice, old and slow and steady as a held breath, walking you gently back down out of the high country, down through the fog, down past the laurel and the hemlock, down to the soft, dark floor of sleep, where even the patient things of these mountains cannot follow. Rest now. The mountain will still be there tomorrow. Tonight, you have already gone far enough. I can't step off the wood. The mud on either side. It isn't mud anymore. It's breathing. And whatever is living under these planks, it just hit the bottom of my boots from underneath. It's striking the wood every time I take a step, waiting for me to miss. Now hush. Let me back up. Let me tell it right, the way the old-timers told it to me when I was young and foolish and still believed the mountain only wanted to be admired. The trail guides always tell you to keep your boots on the wood when the fog rolls heavy across the low gaps. They tell you the narrow, hand-hewn cedar puncheon boardwalks are a sanctuary from the unmapped, swallowing mud of the mountain wetlands. Stay on the planks, they say, like it's some simple commandment. But they never tell you why. They never warn you about the plank stretcher, the thing that waits in that black standing water beneath the bog bridges, patient as the stone itself, older than the trail, older maybe than the mountain's memory of being young. I've walked these ridge lines since before my knees started singing their own slow hymn of complaint. I've seen the fog come down off Brushy Mountain like a held breath, finally let go, swallowing whole hollers in the space of a heartbeat. And I've crossed more bog bridges than I could rightly count, my boots thumping that same hollow, comforting rhythm against cedar boards laid down by hands long since turned to dust. There's a sound to safe wood, a sound you learn in your bones before you ever learn it in your head, A dry, solid, almost musical knock, plank after plank, steady as a heartbeat that hasn't yet learned to be afraid of itself. It was late October, the kind of October that doesn't ask your permission before it gets dark, when I found myself deep in the Roanoke Gap, further off the marked trail than any sensible man ought to wander alone. I'd lost the last gray smear of daylight somewhere around a ridge I didn't recognize, and the fog had come up out of the bog like the earth itself was exhaling something it had swallowed wrong a long, long time ago. It moved different than regular fog, friend. Regular fog drifts. This stuff crawled, low and thick and silver white, pooling first around the ankles, then the knees, rising with a slowness that felt deliberate, felt aware, like it was a tide measuring the exact height of a man before deciding how much of him it wanted to take. The temperature dropped so fast my breath started hanging in front of my face like little ghosts I'd birthed and abandoned. I had my headlamp, but the fog ate the light before it traveled 3 feet, turned the beam into a useless, milky smear that did nothing but make the dark beyond it feel deeper, hungrier. So I did what any man who spent his life in these mountains learns to do. I trusted my boots and the wood beneath them. I trusted that old hollow sound, that steady thump, thump, thump of boot against cedar plank, a rhythm as familiar to me as my own pulse. The bog around me had gone quiet in that particular way wetlands go quiet before something changes. No frogs, no night birds. Even the wind seemed to be holding itself perfectly still, like it didn't want to disturb whatever was listening. I remember thinking even then that the silence had a texture to it, a weight, like the whole bottom of that gap was an ear pressed up against the world, waiting. I walked maybe a half-mile like that, blind and trusting, counting my steps the way my granddaddy taught me, when my headlamp finally found something solid enough to hold its shape through the fog. The boardwalk ahead of me had broken, not rotted through gentle the way wood does over the slow turning of seasons, broken violent, splintered upward in jagged spears, like something underneath had pushed up through it once, hard, and then let it settle back down into ruin. A gap maybe 8 feet wide separated me from the unbroken planks on the other side, and in that gap was water black as a mine shaft, perfectly still, not a ripple disturbing its surface despite the cold wind that should have been kissing it. I stood there a long moment, my light trembling slightly across that black gap. And I want to tell you, friend, that stillness was the loudest thing I have ever witnessed. Water that still isn't natural. Water like that is holding its breath. I had 2 choices laid out before me, plain as a hand of cards. I could turn back, retrace my steps through that crawling fog, and try to find solid trail before full dark swallowed the gap whole. or I could find a way across. And pride, that old familiar killer of mountain men since the first settler, looked at an unclimbable peak and said, "I'll manage." Pride convinced me turning back was the coward's path. To my left, maybe 6 feet off the broken boardwalk, I saw it. A wide, flat patch of marsh grass, dense and green even in the gray light, rising just slightly above the black water around it. It looked solid. It looked, God forgive me, like a shortcut. Like the kind of ground a man's boot could trust. I told myself it was just grass growing over a shallow shelf of earth. I told myself the trail guides exaggerated, the way old stories always do, dressing up simple drowning hazards in folklore clothing to scare children into staying careful. I told myself a lot of things in that gap, standing on the edge of safe wood, staring at temptation dressed up as solid ground. And then I stepped off the boardwalk. The moment my boot left that cedar plank, friend, something in the air itself seemed to shift, like a held note finally resolving into something far worse than silence. My foot sank only an inch into that marsh grass, no deeper, solid enough to bear my weight just like I'd hoped, just like I'd convinced myself it would. Relief flooded through me, warm and stupid and short-lived, because that's when I felt it. A vibration, deep and slow, traveling up through the earth and into the sole of my boot, rising through my ankle, my shin, settling somewhere cold in the pit of my stomach. Not a sound exactly, a pressure, like something enormous had just turned its attention toward the exact spot where I stood, the way a sleeping dog's ear twitches toward an unfamiliar footstep before it's even fully woken. I didn't wait to understand it further. Some old animal instinct buried deep beneath all my mountain-bred logic screamed at me to move, and I scrambled the remaining steps across that grass faster than my aching knees had any right to carry me, throwing myself back onto the unbroken boardwalk on the far side with a desperate, undignified lunge. I lay there a moment, chest heaving, the cedar planks cool and damp beneath my palms. And I told myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Nerves. Fog-addled fear playing tricks on a tired old man's senses. And I stood up, brushed myself off, and started walking again, telling myself the worst of it was already behind me. And that's when I understood, slowly, dreadfully, that the boardwalk had changed its rules entirely. I want you to picture it the way I experienced it, slow and creeping. The boardwalk that should have ended, that should have connected back to the main trail within another quarter mile, simply did not end. I walked further still. The planks continued, identical and unbroken, vanishing into fog ahead of me, exactly as they vanished into fog behind me, like I'd been swallowed into some pocket of the mountain that existed outside the ordinary stretching of distance. And then I heard it, the first thump. It came from directly beneath my left boot, the instant my weight settled onto that plank. A heavy, deliberate thud, like a fist striking wood from the other side, patient and certain. Not the hollow echo of a footstep, something heavier than that, denser, like flesh and bone wrapped in something cold and leathery, slapping itself flat against the underside of the board to feel exactly where I'd planted my weight, exactly how much of me there was to measure. I froze. The fog swirled lazy around my knees, and beneath my feet, silence. A held, patient silence, the kind that waits to see what a man will do next. I took another step, testing, my heart hammering so loud I was certain whatever lived beneath that wood could hear it as clear as I heard my own boots. Thump. Right beneath my right foot this time, the instant it landed. Never a beat behind, matching me, tracking me, learning the rhythm of my body the way a predator learns the rhythm of prey it intends to take its time with, prey it has already decided it owns. I want you to understand, friend, that the thing beneath those planks never once showed itself. Not in any way I could swear to. Not in any way my eyes could carry home with me. Not a shape in the black water below. Not a ripple. Not a glimpse of anything beyond that relentless, patient thumping that rose to meet every single step I dared to take. It didn't need to show itself. It already had my measure, my weight, my stride length, the particular hitch in my gait from an old injury in my left hip that flares up worse in cold weather. It was learning me, the way you'd learn a song you intended to play back perfectly, later, when it mattered most, when the audience was least prepared to hear it. I tried walking faster, hoping speed might confuse whatever rhythm it had built of me. The thumps came faster, too, matched precisely, never lagging, never anticipating wrong. I tried walking slower, dragging out each step with agonizing patience, hoping stillness might bore it into losing interest. And the thing beneath the boards matched that too, drawing out its own response with a kind of mockery, like it found my fear amusing in some cold, ancient way that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with cruelty refined over centuries of quiet, patient practice. Then came the part I still struggle to speak about, even now, even years removed from that gap, even with these mountains grown gentler around me with age. I paused, just to breathe, just to gather whatever scraps of courage remained scattered inside my chest. And in that pause, In that single moment where my boots held still against the planks, the thump came anyway. A single heavy strike directly beneath my right boot, even though I hadn't moved, even though there was no fresh footstep to track, no new disturbance against the wood to respond to. Nothing at all to explain its timing except certainty. It was telling me it didn't need my movement anymore. It already knew exactly where I stood, exactly where I would stand a moment later, and the moment after that. It was simply reminding me that it could reach me whenever it decided the waiting had gone on long enough, that the waiting itself was its own kind of pleasure. I started walking again, faster this time, the fog thickening around me until I couldn't see more than a few planks ahead. The boardwalk narrowing, friend. Actually narrowing. The boards on either side beginning to tilt upward at the edges, like the whole structure was being slowly pinched from beneath by something patient and immovable. I had to brace my boots with surgical precision now, heel to toe, arms out for balance like a man walking a fence rail, while that relentless thumping kept perfect, patient time beneath me, never once missing its mark. The cedar groaned under that pressure, a low, wet creaking that sounded unsettlingly like something breathing, like the wood itself had become a held breath, about to be released, all at once, all over me. I felt the boards shift beneath my weight, not collapsing but bowing, flexing downward toward that black water before springing back with a wet, sucking resistance that left my stomach lurching with every single step, every single test of whether the wood would hold a moment longer. I don't know how long I walked that narrowing, endless path. Time loses its shape entirely in a place like that. Fog erasing the moon, erasing the stars, erasing every ordinary marker a man uses to measure how far he's traveled or how long he's been traveling it, leaving only the wood beneath him and the thing beneath the wood. I only know that somewhere in that endless walking I stopped believing I would ever see the trailhead again. I stopped believing in maps, in distance, in the simple mercy of an ending, the way a man stops believing in summer somewhere deep into a winter that refuses to break. The boardwalk had become my entire world, narrow and wet and groaning, suspended over patient black water that wanted nothing more than for my balance to fail just once. Just one single misstep into mud that wasn't mud anymore, into water that wasn't merely water, into whatever lay waiting just beneath that thin, trembling skin of stillness. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its terrible simplicity, that I would walk this stretch of cedar boards until my body simply could not walk anymore, until my legs gave out beneath me the way the boards themselves seemed always on the verge of giving way. That the mountain doesn't forgive the broken boundary between wood and earth, not once it's been crossed, not for any reason a frightened man might offer in his own defense. That some old, patient hunger beneath these bogs has been waiting centuries for careless feet to step where they shouldn't. And once it has your measure, once it knows the particular rhythm of your stride, the particular hitch in your hip, there is no boardwalk long enough to outrun it. No fog thick enough to hide you from something that hunts by feeling rather than sight, by patience rather than speed. So if you ever find yourself deep in these gaps, friend, when the autumn fog comes crawling low and silver across the wetlands, thick enough to swallow your own outstretched hand, and you come upon a broken stretch of boardwalk with black water waiting still and patient on either side, I am begging you, with whatever weight my old voice still carries across these years, to turn back. Walk the long way around, however far it takes you out of your way. Wait for daylight if you must, even if it costs you a cold and miserable night spent shivering on solid ground. Because that patch of solid-looking grass beside the broken wood is not a shortcut, whatever your tired legs and your wounded pride try to tell you in that moment. It is an invitation, and the thing that answers it does not forget the weight of those who accept. Not ever. Not even after the years have worn smooth every other memory a man carries. I still walk these mountains, even now, all these years removed from that endless gap. My knees worse, my hands shakier, my nights longer than they used to be. But I never step off the wood anymore. Not for shortcuts, not for pride, not for anything this world has ever offered me in trade for that single, careless choice. Because somewhere, friend, deep beneath some forgotten stretch of cedar planking, in water black and still as held breath, something is still listening, still patient, still remembering the exact rhythm of footsteps it never quite got the chance to finish learning. Footsteps it is still waiting, with all the patience this old mountain never taught it, to hear again. And the mountain, friend, the mountain never forgets a debt left unpaid. It only waits for the fog to roll in thick enough, and for some other tired, careless soul to mistake a patch of grass for solid ground. The sharp, ragged breath, the heavy, sliding crunch of boots losing traction on loose shale. A low whisper follows. Okay, Abe, just breathe. Don't look at the fog. Look at your feet. There it is again, above me. That heel drag, That slow metal click, like a pole tip finding a rock. And there it is below me, too. Same second, same sound. Like the mountains got two of whatever's hunting me. One on each lip of this gap. And they're keeping time with each other like a pair of hands clapping on either side of my skull. I cut the switchback. I know I cut it. 40 years telling folks not to, and I went and did the one thing I swore I never would. The laurel's so tight now I can't see past my own arm, but I can hear it breathing, both sides, at once. If you're listening to this and you're up here on the high ridge in weather like this, turn around now. Don't take the shortcut. The mountain remembers who cheats it. Name's Silas Vance. Folks call me Abe on account of my granddad, and I spent 36 years with the Forestry Commission, mostly up in the high counties where the Appalachian Trail does that long, slow climb above 4,000 feet, and the weather turns on you quicker than a man can zip his coat. I want to tell you about a fella I met, just the once, and about a rule I broke, teaching him not to break it. It was late October, the kind of October where the leaves have already gone past their color and dropped into a wet brown mat on the trail, and the cold stopped being a crisp kind of cold and started being a kind that gets down in your joints and stays there. I was up doing a trail assessment on a stretch of ridge that don't see but a couple dozen hikers a season, on account of it being remote, and on account of the elevation gain being enough to break a man's pace if he ain't careful with his water and his daylight. Now, I got to explain something to you, and I want you to really hear it, because it matters to everything that comes after. A switchback ain't just a turn in the trail. It's an argument with gravity. You can't go straight up a steep face, not safely, not for long. So the old CCC boys and the trail crews after 'em laid the path back and forth across the slope in long zigzags, each leg graded careful so the water running off don't carve a gulch and a man's knees don't give out on the way down. And here's the thing that day hikers never understand till somebody like me explains it with a shovel in hand. When you cut a switchback, when you see that lower leg of trail 20, 30 feet below, and think you'll just slide down the bank and save the long way around, you ain't saving time. You're opening a wound. Your boots tear the duff and root mat off that slope, and the next good rain carves it into a gully that widens every season after, till you've got a scar that takes machinery and grant money and a decade to heal, if it heals at all. That's the law of the trail, plain and simple. Don't cut the switchback. It's drilled into every ranger, every crew boss, every Eagle Scout that's ever stood at a trailhead kiosk. It's in the pamphlets. It's on the signs. But there's an older version of that warning, one you won't find printed anywhere, one that gets passed down low and quiet from the old-timers to the ones of us willing to listen. My granddad told it to me sitting on a porch with a coal oil lamp between us, and his granddad told it to him before that. He said, in the deep hollows, the unmapped folds where the ridges run close together and the laurel grows thick enough to swallow a man whole, the mountain don't just erode when you cheat its geometry. It compresses. He said the space between the loops ain't fixed up there, not the way it is on a county road or a survey map. It's more like a held breath. And if you go and cut the distance the mountain laid out a purpose, you ain't skipping 100 feet of switchback. You're inviting the mountain to let that breath out. And whatever's been holding its place in that thicket between the loops, whatever's been waiting for the gap to close, it gets to where it can put a hand on both trails at the same time. I didn't believe it. Not really. Not until October. The fella's name was Daniel. Young fella, maybe 26, 27. Decent boots, but not enough miles broke into him. Carrying a pack that was a size too big for the trip he'd planned. I crossed paths with him early that morning at a trailhead. Told him the Weather Service had a fog advisory for the ridgeline come afternoon. Told him to watch his daylight close on account of how short the days had gotten. He nodded the way they all nod, polite, not really hearing it. I went on with my assessment work further down the slope and didn't think on him again till near 4 in the afternoon, when the fog the Weather Service promised came rolling in across the gap like somebody'd opened a door to a freezer. Now I want you to feel what that fog is like up there, because it ain't like fog in a valley. It comes in low and silver white, and it moves, not drifting exactly, more like crawling, spilling over the ridge crest the way water spills over a dam. And within 10 minutes of it arriving, you can't see your own boots clear, let alone the blaze marks painted on the trees that are supposed to keep you on the path. I was making my way back toward the truck when I heard him. Boots scraping, breath coming in short, raw pulls. The particular sound of a man who's been climbing too hard for too long with too little water in him. I called out, and he near jumped out of his skin coming through the fog toward my light. He told me what had happened, breathless, words tumbling over each other. He'd misjudged his pace bad, burned daylight taking photographs and resting his knees. And now the fog had swallowed the markers behind him, his light was getting low, and his hands had gone numb enough he couldn't feel his own trekking pole grips. And he said something that put a cold feeling straight through my chest, worse than the weather. He said he looked down through a gap in the fog, just for a second, and seen the lower leg of the switchback trail almost directly beneath him. maybe 15 feet down a steep dirt bank, thick with loose shale and old leaf litter. And he'd thought about cutting it. I told him not to. I told him straight out, the way I'm telling you now. Don't cut the switchback. Not here. Not in this fog. Not on this mountain. I told him the ground up here ain't stable, that cutting the bank could put him off a drop he couldn't see. I told him to follow my light and we'd take the long way together, the way the trail was laid. He said he understood. He said okay. And then the fog did something I'd never seen it do before in 36 years on that mountain. It thickened sudden, like a held breath letting go, swallowing my light whole. And for maybe 4, 5 seconds, I lost sight of him entirely. When it thinned again, he was gone. And about 30 feet off, down through a notch in the fog where the bank dropped steep and loose, I heard the long, sliding crunch of a man losing his footing on purpose, letting gravity take him down the shortcut he'd promised me he wouldn't take. I want you to understand that I don't blame him. Cold does things to a man's judgment that fear can't undo. He was desperate, and desperate men take the fast way down. He probably figured he'd land on the lower trail, holler up that he was fine, and we'd both have a laugh about it back at the truck. That ain't what happened. I followed his trail down as best I could, calling his name. And when I came over the lip of that bank myself, careful, using a root for a handhold, not letting the mountain catch me the same way, I found him standing on the lower switchback leg, looking around with a face on him I'd only ever seen once before, on a man who's took a wrong step on ice and is still trying to work out which way is down. He said it looked wrong. He said the trail down there looked exactly like the trail up above. Same width, same gravel scatter, same dead rhododendron leaning over the same kind of bend. And for a second he thought he'd somehow slid back onto the same leg he'd left. But the markers were different. And the fog, he said, had gone from silver white to something closer to milk. Total. No shapes in it at all. Just white in every direction. Like he was standing inside a held breath with no edges to it. I told him to stay put, that I'd come down to him. And I want you to know I believed, right up until the moment I myself looked off the next bank, that I could still talk sense into him, and we'd walk out together the slow way. But the fog had its own ideas, and so, I think, did the mountain. He saw the next tier of switchback below us, another loop, Another bank, maybe 12 feet this time. And before I could get a hand on his shoulder, he'd gone over it too. Said later he didn't even decide to. Said his feet just went, like the ground itself had tilted underneath him and let him slide. That's when the woods went quiet. Now I need you to understand what quiet means up on a ridge like that, because it ain't an absence you'd notice right off. There's always something. Wind working through the canopy. An owl, maybe, starting early on account of the dark coming on. The tick and settle of branches cooling after a warm afternoon. Small sounds, constant. The kind your ear stops registering because they're always there, same as your own heartbeat. Those sounds stopped. All of them. At once. Like somebody had reached out and turned a dial down to nothing. And in that silence, I noticed the trees. The laurel thicket that ran between the two switchback legs. The upper one Daniel had left, and the lower one he'd landed on. It was thick to begin with. The kind of dense mountain laurel that grows so tangled together a man can't push through it without losing skin. But when I looked at it close, using what little I could see through the milk-white fog, I'd swear on my granddad's grave that thicket was narrower than it had been when I'd come over the first bank not 5 minutes before. I measured it the only way a frightened man measures anything in a moment like that. By eye, and by feel, and by the cold certainty settling in my gut. The gap between the upper trail and the lower trail, the gap that should have held 30, 40 feet of slope and brush between it, had closed down to something closer to 20. The trees inside it weren't just close together. They looked pressed. Trunks leaning on trunks that shouldn't have been touching. Branches woven so tight you couldn't have run a hand flat between two of them. The mountain was folding that hollow shut, the way you'd fold a letter to make it smaller. And Daniel and me were standing on the two halves of the page. I called down to him to hold still, to not take another step. And for a moment he listened. I could hear him breathing hard, trying to quiet it. The two of us standing on our separate switchback legs, not 30 feet apart now by my reckoning, though it felt closer. And then I heard it. A click. Metal on stone. The particular sound of a trekking pole tip finding purchase, followed by the slow drag of a boot heel through loose dirt. I figured it was him, shifting his weight, and I near said so. But Daniel's poles were strapped to his pack. He hadn't touched him since the second slide. The sound came again, and this time I placed it proper, and my stomach dropped clean through the soles of my boots, because it wasn't coming from where Daniel stood below me. It was coming from above me, on the trail I'd just left. The same instant it echoed up from somewhere past Daniel on the trail below him. Same click, same drag, same half-second of silence after, like whatever made it was holding its own breath same as we were. Two places, one sound, at the same time. I tested it, God help me, I tested it. The way you'd test a sore tooth with your tongue, even knowing it'll hurt. I took 2 quick steps sideways along my trail, deliberate, loud as I could manage on that gravel. The click answered. Above Daniel and below me, both at once, matching my rhythm exact, like a shadow that don't bother staying on the ground anymore. I stopped dead. It stopped dead. I waited 4 full seconds by my own count, and on the 5th, just as I went to move again, it moved first. 2 steps, same gait as mine, coming from both directions at once, the laurel between us shivering faint with something passing through it that the wind had nothing to do with, on account of there being no wind left at all. Daniel called up to me, his voice gone thin and small in that dead air, and asked if I'd heard it too. I told him to be still. I told him not to test it again. But the thing in the thicket had already learned our rhythm, and it didn't need either of us to move first anymore. The laurel kept tightening while we stood there, leaves rattling soft against each other, though there weren't a breath of air to move 'em. And I judged the gap between our 2 trails at no more than 6 or 8 feet now, close enough that if Daniel had reached out his trekking pole full extended, he might near have touched the branches on my side of that thicket. That's when the breathing started. Not mine, not Daniel's. Something low and wet and patient, coming from inside the laurel itself, from the narrow, dark seam where the 2 trails had nearly become one. Inches away through the leaves, slow as a thing that's got all the time the mountain can give it. I never saw a shape, not clear, just a warping in the fog where the branches knotted thickest, a darkness that seemed to lean without moving, the way a shadow leans when the light behind it shifts. I told Daniel to climb. Not toward me, not toward him. Straight up, away from both legs of that trail, back the long way, the way the mountain meant for him to go. I don't rightly know how he made it. I don't rightly know how I made it, neither. I know the breathing followed us a little ways up that bank, slower with every foot of distance, like it understood the wager and was content to lose this once. We never spoke of it on the drive out, not one word. But I think on it most every fall, when the fog comes crawling low across that ridge, And I wonder how many old switchback scars cut into these mountains ain't scars at all. How many of 'em are still foldin', slow and patient, somewhere up past the blaze marks, waitin' on the next tired pair of boots to find the shortcut. So if you're ever up there, and the light's runnin' thin, and you see that lower trail temptin' you through a gap in the fog, don't cut the switchback. The straps. Lord help me. The straps are on the ground. Both of 'em. Pooled up in the mud like dropped laundry. Not an inch of tension left in the webbing. The bark just there. Untouched. And I'm still up here. 6 feet off the leaves, easy. Floatin'. Rockin' slow. Like there ain't nothing wrong at all. Like gravity itself done forgot my name. Something under me. Something under the fabric. Holding me soft. Cradling me like I weigh nothing more than a fallen branch. I can feel it breathing beneath the nylon. I can feel its fingers finding the shape of my spine. Now, before I take you up onto that ridge with him, let me tell you something the trail guides never put in their pamphlets. They'll tell you to sleep off the ground. Get up out the damp, out the cold seep of the earth, away from the things that crawl low at night. Good advice far as it goes. But there's a mistake buried in that good advice. A quiet one. The kind that don't announce itself till it's far too late to climb down. They never tell you to look at what's beneath where you hang. 2 trees might frame the prettiest, most level stretch of ground a man ever found to rest his bones, and still be marking the lip of something old, something hollow, something that's been waiting a long, long while for a body to come drifting down into reach. The earth in these mountains keeps its own quiet accounts, and some of 'em get settled slow in the deep of the night, while a tired man thinks he's only sleeping. Ben had hiked alone more times than he could rightly count. Late October was his favorite season for it. The leaves gone copper and rust, the crowds thinned out, the whole Blue Ridge feeling like it belonged just to him and whatever quiet things lived in the laurel thickets. He was experienced, careful, the kind of hiker who checked his weather 3 times and still packed for worse, who'd learned the hard way never to trust a clear sky in these hills past sundown. That evening he was moving along a high, narrow spine of ridge, the trail no wider than a deer path in places, dropping off steep on either side into hollows you couldn't see the bottom of even in daylight. The fog came up slow, the way it does in those old mountains, rising out of the gaps like the earth itself was exhaling. milk white and thick, and it didn't roll so much as it crept, swallowing the trail behind him a few yards at a time till he couldn't rightly say where he'd been. His trekking poles kept their rhythm against the stone. Tap, 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 muffled and strange in all that white, the sound coming back to him soft and wrong, like the fog was holding on to it a half-second longer than it should. Somewhere off below him, hidden by all that white, a creek was running high and steady, and even that sound came to him distant and damp, like the whole mountain had been wrapped up tight in wet cotton. He'd hiked through plenty of fog before, but there was something about the way this particular bank moved that put him in mind of water filling a basin, slow and deliberate, finding every low place on that ridge and pouring itself in. Dark fell fast up there, and the temperature with it, sinking toward freezing before he'd even thought to stop and look for a camp. That's when he found the clearing, small, flat, ringed in dead bracken, and dominated by two ancient oaks standing maybe 15 feet apart, their trunks wide as oil drums, bark deep grooved and silvered with age. The kind of trees that had likely stood watch over that ridge longer than any trail had run through it. Good hammock trees. Perfect, even. He let his headlamp drift down between them, and that's where he saw it. A deep, shadow-pooled bowl in the earth, thick with dead leaves drifting down into a collapsed hollow beneath the roots. The kind of cavity you find where a tree's been slowly eating away the ground beneath itself for 100 years. He didn't think much of it. Just a low spot. Just a place the leaves like to gather. He'd seen plenty such hollows on plenty such ridges. Always assumed they were just old root systems finally giving up the fight against gravity and time. And he saw no reason that night to think any different. He went about his business the way he'd done it 1,000 times before. Unrolled the modern double-layered nylon, slate green, stretched taut and silent between the oaks, pulled the polyester tree straps tight, felt that satisfying resistance as the slack disappeared, heard the clean metal snap of the carabiners locking home, tested his weight, felt it hold steady, felt the whole rig settle into that low, even hum of tension that means a hammock's hung true. Strung his rainfly tight overhead against whatever weather the night still owed him, staking down the corners with the careful precision of a man who'd learned long ago that a sloppy pitch made for a miserable night. Satisfied, he crawled down into his winter mummy bag, snug and narrow as a coffin built for warmth instead of stillness, and zipped it shut behind him, chin to ankle, one long metal seam closing him off from the cold and from everything else besides. His arms pinned tight along his sides, his legs bound straight together. A man, sealed up snug inside his own small, dark, immobile world, resting just a few feet above a hollow he never once thought to call dangerous, letting the first soft patter of rain against the rainfly lull him down toward sleep, same as it always had. He woke at 3:13 in the morning. He'd remember that number a long while after. The little green glow of his watch face, the only light he trusted at first. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, and what was left behind it was a silence so heavy, so complete, it pressed down on his ears like water. No wind, no insects, not even the soft tick of cooling rain-fly nylon. Just cold and dark, and that thick, waiting quiet that mountains get sometimes. Like the whole ridge was holding its breath along with him, waiting on something it weren't ready yet to name. He lay there a moment, letting his eyes adjust, telling himself it was just the cold that had woke him, same as it woke a man most every winter night out on a ridge like this. And then he felt it. A motion, slow, deliberate, side to side, side to side, even and unhurried as a porch swing worked by a patient hand. Not the wind, there weren't no wind to speak of, but something rocking him with a rhythm too steady, too intentional to be anything natural. And beneath that motion, something else, a pressure, broad and flat against the small of his back, pushing up gentle through the fabric, like a hand the size of a door frame was cupped beneath him, taking the whole weight of his body into itself, the way you'd take hold of something you didn't aim to let fall. The pressure shifted ever so slightly, settling itself more precisely beneath the curve of his spine, as though whatever it was had taken a moment to find the exact balance point of him, and now meant to keep him there. He told himself it was the wind catching the underside of the tarp. He told himself the ground had shifted, that maybe a root had given somewhere below and tilted the whole rig. He told himself a great many things in them first few groggy minutes, the way a man will when his mind's still half down in sleep and don't want to climb the rest of the way up into something it can't explain, something that don't fit nowhere in the ordinary shape of the world he'd known up till now. But the rockin' didn't stop, and that pressure beneath his back didn't ease. So he fumbled, slow and clumsy, inside the tight sleeve of his bag, for the little headlamp clipped at his collar, thumbed it on, worked the zipper of the bug net down with fingers gone stiff from cold, just enough to crane his neck and look toward the trees holding him aloft. What he saw took the breath clean out of him. The straps, both of 'em, hanging loose and limp from the bark. Not a hair of tension left in the polyester webbing, pooled down at the base of each oak like something dropped and forgotten. Unattached, useless. And yet there he hung, same as ever, 6 feet up off them dead leaves, rockin' soft and steady in the freezin' dark, held aloft by absolutely nothing a man's mind could call sensible. His headlamp was dyin'. The beam had gone that thin, sickly yellow color batteries get right before they quit on you for good. Barely strong enough to push back the fog, still clinging low and patient around the clearing. With hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking, he turned that failing light down, past the edge of the hammock, past the place where green nylon gave way to black air, into the black mouth of the root hollow below. He had to will his arm to keep moving, every animal instinct in him saying to just lie still, to just let the dark stay dark and unexamined. And there, Lord, there, 2 arms, long past any natural length, thin as driftwood left bleached too many seasons in a creek bed, the gray, bloodless color of something that ain't seen sunlight since before Ben's granddaddy was born. They rose straight up out of the loose dirt at the bottom of that hollow, not bent at any elbow a man would recognize, just long and straight and patient, ending in wide spread fingers pressed flat against the underside of his hammock, pressed there gentle, almost tender, the way you'd cradle something precious you didn't want to wake, something you'd already waited a long, long while to finally hold. The skin of those fingers, if it was skin at all, looked thin enough that the headlamp's failing light seemed almost to pass through it, the way light passes through the edge of a moth's wing held up against a lantern. Ben understood, in that frozen, breathless second, that he could not move, could not run, could not so much as kick free, because his own legs were bound tight and straight inside that mummy bag, zipped shut by his own hand hours before in a moment of perfect, foolish safety. To thrash was to tip, and to tip, zipped up, blind and helpless as he was, meant falling straight down into them long gray arms, into that soft, patient, waiting grip, into whatever else waited further down in that hollow than his light could ever hope to reach. The thought of it alone seemed to drain what little warmth he had left in him, faster even than the cold had managed. So when he did move, just a small, terrified shiver of emotion, the arms responded, gentle, correcting, a slow tilt, a careful recentering, easing him back to the middle of the hammock, same as a mother settling a fussing child back into the crook of her arm. Powerful beyond reckoning, and yet so soft about it, so unhurried, like there weren't no rush at all to whatever it was fixin' to do with him, like it had already waited a long while and could wait plenty longer still. And underneath the slow creak of nylon, underneath his own ragged breath, he heard it. A whisper, wet and rhythmic, matching the swing of him perfect, like wet leaves dragging slow across cold stone. It weren't trying to hurt him. That was a thing Ben come to understand somewhere deep in them long black hours, even as every part of him screamed otherwise. The grip never tightened. The fingers never dug in. It rocked him soft and steady, same as you'd rock down a colicky infant at 3 a.m, patient past anything human, like it had all the time left in the world, and not one single reason to hurry. Like time itself meant something entirely different to whatever waited down in that hollow than it ever could mean to him. It was trying to put him to sleep, and he understood, too, with a cold dread that settled deeper than the freezing air around him, colder even than the metal zipper pressed against his chin, that whatever happened once sleep took him proper, whatever came next, he wasn't meant to be awake to feel it. That much somehow he knew without being told. The same way a man knows certain things in dreams, with no proof to point to, and no doubt left over either. So he fought it. Fought the warm, heavy pull dragging at the backs of his eyes with everything left in him. He counted backward from 1,000, losing his place once or twice and starting over each time. He recited the names of every shelter he'd ever slept in, every trail marker, every creek crossing he could dredge up from memory, his whispering voice gone thin and cracked in the dark. He pinched the soft webbing of his own thumb hard enough to leave a bruise, anything to keep the edges of the world sharp a little longer. But the rockin' never stopped. Hour after hour, slow as a held breath, patient as stone, patient as something that had been doing this exact same thing for longer than them old oaks themselves had stood. The cold sank deeper into his bones with every passing minute. And somewhere far off beneath that endless gentle swaying, his thoughts commenced to soften, to blur, to slip loose of their edges one by one, no matter how hard he clawed after 'em. The cameras, such as they were, picked up nothing more after that. Just the rain returning sometime before dawn, soft against the leaves. Just the slow, steady creak going on a long, long while into the dark. And then, eventually, not going on at all. Morning brought a ridge runner up that same narrow spine, making her rounds same as she did most every week along that stretch. She found the camp sitting quiet and undisturbed in the gray early light. Rain fly intact, gear stowed neat, nothing disturbed by weather or by beast. But the tree straps lay loose and slack against the bark of both old oaks, pooled in the cold mud same as Ben had seen 'em hours before. And the hammock itself had gone flat, collapsed down into the heart of that root hollow, sunk low into the leaves, like a thing that had simply stopped being held. Inside it, the mummy bag lay zipped shut tight, sealed clean from the inside the same way Ben himself had sealed it the night before. Entirely empty. No sign of him in the leaves round about. No boot prints leading off into the fog. No scrap of gear missing from where he'd laid it out so carefully the evening before. Just that hollow shape pressed into the bag's lining where a body had lain. And the cold settled deep into the fabric, like it had soaked there for years instead of hours. The ridge runner didn't stay there long. Some places, once you've stood in 'em a while, don't seem to want letting go of whatever they've decided to keep. So when you go on up into them old hills, and you go looking for 2 fine trees to sling your rest between, take a moment, won't you, and look down first at what's resting below. Mind the hollows. Mind the deep shadowed bowls where the dead leaves like to gather and never seem to blow away no matter how hard the wind comes through. Mind the quiet, low places the earth has hollowed out for itself over all them slow, patient years. 'Cause something down there might just be patient enough, might just have waited long enough already to wait on you a while longer still, to wait on you to finally close your eyes. Don't move. Lord, don't you move a muscle, son. It's still out there. I can hear it. Breathing. Easy, slow, like it's got all the time in the world. And I reckon it does. My own breath, it's just hanging there in front of me, froze solid in the headlamp light, like somebody took a photograph of the fog and left it dangling in the air. And there's another cloud out past it, bigger, darker at the edges, coming from the laurel. It ain't mine. I want you to remember that, whoever's listening to this, whatever's left of this tape. That second cloud, it ain't mine. Now you just settle back down into them blankets, friend. Pull 'em up around your chin. I'm gonna tell you how it started. Real slow. The way these things always start. Which is to say, they don't seem like nothing at all until they're everything. I've lived up in these ridges most near 70 years now, and I've buried kin in dirt so hard in October you'd think the ground itself was trying to keep us out. Folks come through here on the trail, the long one, the one that runs the spine of these old mountains clear from Georgia up into Maine. And they got maps, good maps, some of 'em. GPS units that talk to satellites flying way up yonder, past where the air even bothers to be air anymore. But there's a stretch. There's a stretch up past the gap where the trail forgets itself a little, where the blazes get sparse, and the rhododendron grows in so thick it's like walking through the throat of something old. The map's got a dotted line through there. The old folks just got a name for it, and I won't be saying that name on this tape. On account of names is how you call a thing to you, and I ain't interested in calling nothing to nobody tonight. It was late October when this happened. The kind of October where the cold don't creep in gentle like a house guest knocking at the door. It comes in sudden, like somebody left a window open clear up at 4,000 feet, and the whole mountain just exhales winter 2 months early. There'd been a cold snap settle in over the ridge, the kind the old-timers used to call a hard frost warning, back before the weather fellas on the television started putting fancy names on everything. The air gets thin up there this time of year, thin and sharp, like breathing in good whiskey, if whiskey could cut you a little on the way down. Our hiker, and I'll just call him that on account of it don't much matter what name his mama gave him. Not anymore. He was solo. Had been for 9 days, doing what they call a shakedown of the high ridge spur before trying it again come spring, with better gear, better boots, better scents maybe. Those scents ain't something you can buy at no outfitter store. He was tired in that particular way a body gets tired after walking 15, 16 miles with a pack that's heavier than it has any right to be. Tired down in the joints. Tired in the kind of place where your thinking gets thin, same as that mountain air, and you start making decisions you wouldn't make if you was sitting safe in your own kitchen with a cup of coffee. Now I want you to understand something, and I want you to hold on to it the way you'd hold a candle in a draft. The old folks up here, the ones who knew these ridges before they ever cut a trail through 'em, they had rules about the cold. Not rules like wear a coat, though Lord knows that's good advice too. Deeper rules. Rules about what the cold was, up high, on certain nights, in certain hollows. They used to say the high gaps could go empty. That's the word my granddaddy used. Empty. Like the air itself had been poured out of a cup and something else moved in to fill the space where the warmth used to sit. He'd tell me, when I was just a boy sitting by his stove, that on the coldest nights, Way up where the balsams thin out and the rock starts poking through like bone through old skin, the air goes hungry. Hungry for what little heat a living thing carries around in its chest. And he'd tell me the first rule, the only rule that mattered, real plain and real simple. He'd say, "Silas, you never go showing the empty air what you got to lose." I didn't understand him then. I was young, and being young is its own kind of cold snap, where you think you can't lose nothing you ain't already decided to give away. But I understand him now. I understand him with my whole chest, every single night, especially this one. He used to say there was a difference between regular cold and old cold. Regular cold, you can outwalk it, shame it right back into the tree line. But old cold, granddaddy cold, the kind that settles into a hollow on a still October night and just sits there, patient as Sunday. That ain't weather at all. It's more like a visitor. And visitors up here in these old hills, you learn quick which ones you invite in and which ones you let knock till they tire themselves out and wander off. The empty air, he said, was the kind of visitor you never invited in, on account of once it knows your name, you don't ever forget it. Our hiker didn't have a granddaddy telling him these things by a stove. He had a guidebook and a weather app that had lost its signal 4 miles back, and the steady, comforting click, click, click of his trekking poles against the frozen trail, which is a sound I want you to hold on to too, friend, on account of there is something awful peaceful about that rhythm. Click, 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 like a clock keeping time for nobody but the mountain. He walked that sound through the dark for hours, headlamp cutting a small cone of gold through air so cold it near sparkled, like the night itself had frost growing on it. You resting easy now? Good. Good, you keep on resting. I'm going to tell you what he did next. And I need you to understand he wasn't a fool. Not really. He was just tired. And tired men forget the old rules, same as anybody. There's a switchback up on that ridge that'll break a man's spirit before it breaks his legs. Steep, near vertical in stretches. The kind of climb where you stop counting your steps and just start counting your breaths instead. In and out. Watching your own life happen in little white puffs in front of your face. He'd been climbing that grade for the better part of an hour, and by the time he crested the worst of it, his legs had gone to water, and his lungs was burning cold from the inside, the way they do when the air's so thin and sharp it feels like breathing in glass shavings. And just off the trail, where the laurel grew in so dense and old it formed a kind of tunnel, a dark, low archway of branches twisted together by maybe 100 years of windstorms. He saw a flat rock. Just a rock. Nothing special about it to look at. But it called to his tired legs the way a porch swing calls to an old man at the end of a long day. And he stepped off that trail, ducked under them laurel branches, and sat himself down at 2 o'clock in the morning, alone, in the kind of dark that don't have a bottom to it. Now I want you to picture that laurel tunnel with me, real slow. The way the branches arch up overhead and weave together so tight that no moonlight gets through. Not even the thin sliver hanging up there that night. The way cold pools down low in a hollow like that, settling the way water settles, filling every low place first. He was sitting in a cold pocket, friends, a pocket the mountain had been saving up for who knows how long. He clicked his trekking poles together and laid 'em across his knees, pulled his buff up over his nose, and just to pass a tired, quiet minute, just out of some small, harmless curiosity, the kind that's never once hurt nobody back home in town, he reached up and turned that headlamp to its highest, brightest setting. Turned that little cone of light from a candle flame into something more like a flashlight beam, cutting a clean column through the black laurel tunnel in front of him. And he thought to himself, the way tired men think foolish little thoughts in the deep of the night, I wonder just how cold it's really got up here. And he took in a long, slow breath through his nose, down deep into them aching lungs of his. Held it a second the way you might hold the last bit of a good thought, and let it out, slow and heavy, right through his open mouth, dead center into that beam of light. And friend, I want you to see it, same as he must have seen it. That breath came out of him like a living thing, a great pale plume of vapor, thick as smoke off a chimney, glowing soft and white in that headlamp beam, swirling up and out in slow, lazy curls. It was beautiful in its way. It is when the cold's bad enough. Beautiful and a little sad, like watching a piece of your own warmth leave you and not come back. He probably smiled at it. Tired men smile at small wonders. That cloud should have drifted off into the dark, thinned out and disappeared, same as breath has done since the first man ever breathed on the first cold night since the beginning of all things. It didn't. It just hung there in the light, perfect and white and whole, like somebody had reached out and frozen time itself around it. Not thinning, not moving, just waiting. Now you stay tucked in real tight for this next part, friend. I mean it. Pull them covers up over your shoulders. He sat there staring at that frozen breath for longer than a man ought to stare at anything, his tired mind trying to make some kind of sense out of the thing that didn't have sense in it to find. 20 seconds went by. 30. A minute, maybe, though time gets strange and slow when something's wrong. And then, way down at the far edge of that headlamp beam, right where the gold light gave up and the black laurel dark took back over, something moved. Not a branch, not the wind, 'cause there weren't no wind that night, not a breath of it, what you should have taken note of, but tired men don't take note of much. A second cloud came drifting out of that blackness, slow, unbothered, a great heavy plume of frost-white vapor, easily 3-4 times the size of his own poor little breath, rolling out from somewhere down low in that laurel tunnel, from somewhere that did not have a mouth he could see, and should not have had a mouth at all. And it matched him. It matched the shape of his own exhale, perfect and slow, like something had been sitting in that dark, watching him breathe, and decided after all this time to breathe right back. The temperature dropped so fast and so far in that next half a second that he felt it in his teeth before he felt it anywhere else. That's a true thing, friend. You'll feel the real cold in your teeth first, like biting down on tinfoil, before your skin even has the chance to catch up and tell you you're afraid. He went to pull in his next breath, natural as anything, the way a body does 1,000 times an hour without ever once thinking on it, and there weren't nothing there to breathe. Now that, friend, that is a particular kind of terror that don't come with no teeth, no claws, no growling in the dark. That is the terror of your own chest fighting for something that the air has decided not to give you. He told me, and yes, I did speak to him after, which is its own story for another night. He told me it weren't like choking. Choking, your body fights you. This was different. The air itself went thin and reluctant, like drinking the last sip of cold coffee through a straw with a hole in it. He pulled and pulled at that air and got next to nothing back for his trouble. And all the while that second great cloud, the one that didn't belong to him, was drifting closer, slow as a held grudge, drawing his own little frozen breath right out of the light and into itself, pulling it in like a man savoring the last bite of something good. It was taking his warmth, friend, pulling it clean out of that beam of light, out of his chest, out of the marrow of him, slow and patient as a mountain that's got nothing but time on its hands, on account of it's had time since before there was a time worth counting. And here's the part that sat with him longest, the part he couldn't shake loose no matter how many summers passed after. It weren't cruel about it. That's the word he kept coming back to, setting across from me at my own kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee cup like he still couldn't quite trust his fingers to stay warm. It weren't angry, weren't hungry the way a bear's hungry, snarling for what it wants. It was just thorough. Same as winter's thorough, working into every crack in a fence post till the wood gives. There weren't no malice he could point to, and somehow that was worse on account of malice you can reason with, or run from, or beg. You can't beg a season to spare you. It just does what it's always done, up there where the rules of regular living don't carry no weight at all. He didn't run. Couldn't, not at first. And running takes air, and air was the one thing in this whole world he didn't have to spare no more. So he done the only thing a man in that kind of trouble can do. He took the smallest breath his body would allow him. A sip, really, not a breath at all. And he held it like the last dollar in his pocket on a rainy day. And he started crawling, slow, dead silent, back toward that trail, back toward the switchback, back toward anywhere that weren't this particular patch of empty, hungry dark. Every few feet he allowed himself one more of them little sippin' breaths, shallow as a sleepin' baby's. And each time he done it, he heard that second cloud sigh out behind him in the laurel, slow and satisfied, like it knew, same as the mountain knows, that a man can only crawl so fast, and the cold gets the last word regardless. It took him near on 2 hours to crawl the 1/4 mile back to where the trail widened and the laurel thinned and the moon found him again, pale and shaken and gulping down air like it was the finest thing he'd ever tasted, which I reckon after that it surely was. So now you know, friend, same as I know, same as my granddaddy knew sitting by that old stove a long, long time ago. The high ridges got their own rules, and them rules don't bend for nobody. Not for guidebooks, not for GPS units, not for a tired man's small and harmless curiosity about how cold the nights really got. You never go showing the empty air what little warmth you got left to lose. Not ever. Not even just to see the pretty shape it makes hanging there in the light. So you stay under them covers tonight, you hear me? Stay deep down where it's warm, where your breath don't have to go anywhere at all except right back into your own chest, safe and slow and yours alone. Don't go testing the cold. Don't go calling to the dark to see if anything calls back. Some things up in these mountains have been waiting an awful long time to answer. Good night, friend. Sleep easy now. Sleep on home.